you're trying to use. I'll just say that again. My understanding of efficiency is, does the airflow work correctly for the size you're trying to use, for the weight you're trying to use? Like, does the voice sound correct, right? Is it full for what you're trying to do?
Even before fullness as a concept, right? Efficiency is about how we're converting airflow into sound. So, God in heaven, I deliver me from this. Oh my God, my head is gonna
I'm
explode.
sorry.
I'm dying. All right,
Are
okay.
you are you sick or did you swallow water wrong?
No, I had a single saltine cracker that decided to fuck my entire existence up. So yeah, it saw that I
That's what
just
happens when you
devoured
get
brethren,
surprised.
and it was like, I'm gonna fucking get you, bitch, and it did. It got me. It got me so bad.
That's what happens when you have clockable cracker crunches.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Crump, crump, crump. How dare you? Oh my God. All right, hold on. I'm gonna have a sip of water, and all is gonna be. This is over. I'm declaring it's over right now.
Got it.
How are y'all seasoning your water, by the way? Everyone should be seasoning your water.
I don't.
Put a little salt in it,
I
put a
don't.
little cayenne pepper, put a little squeeze of lime, season the water.
Uh,
It's really making a difference in my
my
experience of hydration.
my water has gay frog juice in it.
I'm still drinking Monster then, I see.
No, no. Actually, I haven't drank Monster in a week. A little over a week.
Really? GG.
Yeah,
Congrats.
pog.
All
Yep.
right. Kill me. Okay, so let's start over. Let's talk about efficiency and what we're talking about here. So, when we start to produce sound, sound production happens at the level of the vocal folds, right? So we inhale air, um, and then that air wants to just leave. It wants to just like exit the body very comfortably and naturally. So if you were to inhale and exhale silently, that is our sort of easiest mode of inhalation and exhalation, right? So go ahead and take a deep breath in and out.
Purposely enunciating for the microphone.
Yeah, now do it again, and this time delete the sound. So I want there to be no audible sound of air escaping your body, but obviously let the air escape your body. Damn, that's stealthy. I can't tell what the fuck is happening. GG.
Good job.
Was that an
Go
inhalation and an
me.
exhalation that just happened?
Yeah, I did it like 5 times.
Okay, cool. I didn't hear fuck all. So that's exactly what we want. Oh, oh, is this gonna happen again? Am I gonna cough again? Because God hates me. Okay, so our goal is basically that same level of like engagement, that same feeling of difficulty. That's how hard it should be to produce sound. So what ends up happening is when we start phonating, that is when the vocal folds start to get involved in. There's like one little cracker crumb on my folds, and it is the most uncomfortable thing. And I feel like I just need to like I'm gonna die. Okay, so
Do it, Hearth. Clear your throat.
I literally have been literally coughing nonstop, and it refuses to get dislodged. So fuck that. Um, what we experience, right, is that the vocal folds close over the airway, and when they close over the airway, they stop the flow of air. I want you to experience what that feels like. So I want you to go and fully seal. Now that was some closure, but that's not just your true folds that are doing that. That's also your false folds. The um, larynx evolved as a valve structure. It is a system that is designed to keep things out of your lungs. And as you can hear from my coughing constantly and the feeling of like almost dying, that it's working, right? Like it's preventing the fucking cracker crumb that I inhaled from going into my lungs, and instead it's getting caught by these higher level structures, this the false folds and the true folds, which is what they originally evolved for. They seal shut to prevent fluids and food particulates from getting into the airway, because if they get into the airway, then you have like a single piece of food in your lungs, and then that turns into a an infection, and then you die, right? Like
No,
it's pretty serious
hate to hear
business.
it.
We hate to hear it. We hate to see it. We hate to experience it, I'm sure. So, what's happening is there's sort of three lines of defense. When I swallow something, if I'm taking a sip of water, right, I'm going to first like swallow that water. It goes down like through my mouth and down to the back of my throat where there's a little split in the road. It can go into my airway or it can go into my esophagus. Now, the first line of defense is the epiglottis. It's this cartilage that shuts that prevents that stuff from going further into your airway, and then everything goes into your esophagus and then into your stomach and blah blah blah. So that's totally fine. Past the epiglottis, you start to get the false folds, which are the structure above the true folds, and they seal shut again to make sure that no water or whatever gets into your lungs, and then your true folds, which seal shut. This is the entire reason that they evolved is to act as a valve and prevent fluids, food particulates from getting into your lungs. Over time, they evolved a secondary benefit, which was that if you blew air past them, they produced sound. And then there was an evolutionary benefit to sound production, and that's why we have this whole vocal apparatus and everything that we use in speech as humans and other animals. So, the first thing we have to understand is that this phonation business is not an efficient sound production scheme. This is not something that was designed to produce sound. It was something that was designed to keep you from choking, that has been co-opted and turned into a sound production device, right? So
Yeah.
evolution jerry-rigged this shit. So that's step one to understand. So what we get is that the airflow, we start to inhale, and then as we start to exhale, the vocal folds shut, and they can shut to prevent that air from leaving, and that is right. You can hear I started with it shut, and then I released. And when I released, the airflow was able to go without any issue. So we can clamp shut with both the false folds and the true folds, just the true folds, just the false folds, and different degrees of those different kinds of closure are going to produce different kinds of sounds. Normally, you encounter that and your body goes, okay, let me not try to force air past these structures for a second, because it sounds like this person is trying to hold their breath for some reason. And there's a wide range of reasons why we might do that, including things like childbirth, defecation, like lifting heavy weights, any other kind of exertion that we might do. So as we start to like, if you lift something really heavy, or people at the gym, you've ever heard some bro squatting, 350, and he's like, ugh, and you get that like, ugh, restraint and then release. That's just the false folds clamping shut to assist the body in um, that broad movement. Because what do we note? If your body is basically an empty sack of meat, if you aren't full of air, your muscles have nothing to fight against. Your muscles, especially the muscles in your abdomen,
rely on having a certain pressure inside your body to work against. Otherwise, it's like, you're just an empty meat sack. That's not very cool. So that seal forms, and then we're able to kind of resist the desire of the air to leave the body. Well, phonation is just that. It is a controlled resistance at the glottis. The kind of mental image that I like to use is sort of the sound of like, have you ever inflated a balloon and pinched it shut with your fingers before you've tied the end of the balloon?
Yes.
Yeah, it's like normal, right? If you've played with latex balloons or whatever. That is kind of what's happening when we produce sound. Have you ever taken that and then like kind of like squinched or squeezed the little nozzle and let the air leave and it goes like right? It starts to make weird noises, it starts to make little squeaky sounds. That's what your vocal folds are doing. They're just buzzing. You've pinched them shut, but not so shut that that the air can't find a way past the vocal folds. So that is kind of the fundamental action of what is happening with phonation. The valve that is inside your throat transforms that breath energy, that subglottal pressure. Christ almighty. It transforms that subglottal pressure and that airflow energy into sound energy. Efficiency is a sort of perceptual sound quality that allows us to assess how efficiently, hence the name, someone is able to transition that or transform that breath energy into sound energy. If we're producing this sound, okay, then realistically speaking, that airflow is going to have to work to change into sound energy. It's going to have to pass your vocal folds, and your vocal folds have to produce the perfect amount of resistance to vibrate using that airflow as fuel for their vibration. If that sound isn't balanced between the behavior of your vocal folds, as you pointed out, and the behavior of the airflow, we start to get imbalances in the sound and inefficiency begins to manifest. So we already understand from our conversation last week or 2 weeks ago about weight that the vocal folds are capable of changing their own geometry. They change size, they change shape in a way that we physically cannot control. They are beyond the sort of ability of humans to manipulate, except by thinking of perceptual qualities, right? So I know theoretically that if I aim or intend to create a lighter sound, my vocal folds make a series of adjustments and get a different shape and a different sort of length and a different overall thinness, and the geometry of the fold and how it meets the other fold changes, and then we get a lighter sound. But all of that is happening under the hood, beyond or below the level of my ability to perceive. So it's kind of useless. It's like I know that it happens, but I don't actually experience it in any kind of meaningful way. But what we can hear is if I'm aiming for a lighter sound and I start to get some kind of inefficiency. And there's a couple of different kinds of inefficiency that we might want to look out for. The first is a kind of blocked sound. A block sounds like this. Ah. Can you hear how the onset of that sound was slightly blocked? That is to say, it was a little bit more closure at the level of the vocal folds than is necessarily ideal. And then what happened was the vocal folds closed, and I tried to force air past them. It didn't succeed because I'm able to withstand that high degree of pressure because I'm clamping shut with both my false folds and my true folds. And And then it's not until I start to release that sensation of block that the sound is able to travel, right? Because it requires a certain degree of airflow to produce vibration. If the air isn't moving, it's not going to vibrate jack shit. Does that all make sense so far?
Yes.
So this is one kind of inefficiency that we might have, and this is in an inefficiency sort of in the onset of the sound. In my experience, people in general tend to get inefficiencies in sound in a couple of specific distinct places. They get it on the onset, they get inefficiency in the sustain, or they get inefficiency in the offset. So the onset is sort of the conditions for how the sound arises. The sustain is the conditions for how the sound is maintained across a long period of time. And then the offset is how we end the sound. So sometimes people will get inefficiency like this. I'm going to sustain cleanly, I'm going to onset cleanly, but I'm going to offset in a very rough way. And that'll sound like this. Ah. So what we experience there is the vocal folds are vibrating, 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 everything's fine, but then at the end, I'm still trying to push air through, and then in order to stop the sound, I'm instead clamping shut with my vocal folds. To end the sound. And you can hear that at the very end, the very last little fraction of a second, there was a little that sound of closure as the vocal folds and the false folds shut on top of the sound, thereby preventing the airflow and thereby preventing efficient sound production. Now, many people don't actually seal shut fully like that. So what we will see is a slow taper in the sound and therefore a longer period of inefficiency. So something like this. Where the duration of that offset starts to increase because they're not being very precise about when to clamp shut. In any event, clamping shut is not the way that we want to internalize ending sound. The way that we want to end sound is to stop phonating, right? So we let the vocal folds separate and let the airflow escape normally, right? So one way that we can kind of approach that is if someone is having a hard time with an offset, I like to force them to inhale at the end of a sound. So you would sustain a sound and go, ah, and breathe in. This has the effect of causing expansion in the glottis. The vocal folds open up to allow that intake of air, and that means they're not clamping shut. If we hear an inhalation and the inhalation sounds audible, that's an automatic indication, right, that we are hearing some kind of turbulence caused by the vocal folds, the true folds, or the false folds, right? So if I go, that sound is the sound of my inhalation being strong enough to create some kind of ingressive phonation. So ingressive meaning inward as opposed to egressive or aggressive, producing sound through outward exhalation. So that's one way that we might manifest some inefficiency is at the sort of tail end of a sound. But also we can get some inefficiency in the initiation of the sound. And so here it's really important to kind of talk about the conditions of onset. So onset to produce sound requires two things. The vocal folds have to come close enough that they can start to be agitated by airflow and that airflow can cause them to vibrate against one another to produce sound. They also need to have enough airflow to cause them to be agitated. So you can seal shut your folds completely, but there's not really any sound there because I'm not actually actively trying to push any sound out. If instead I went, the same action, but I'm trying to phonate through it, and you can hear it's kind of choppy and a little bit gross. So when we're thinking of an onset, we're thinking of two kind of parts, the action of the vocal folds and the action of the breath. Those need to kind of work together as a team. We want the action of the folds to close the folds and bring them closer together while the airflow just starts. So we want the sort of like initiation of airflow and the initiation of closure to begin at the same exact moment, and that produces a balanced onset. So if we have airflow and then breath, or excuse me, airflow and then closure working together in concert will produce a nice clean onset like so. Ah, ah, that second one was better. The first one was um, a little bit of a breathy onset. Ah, ah, ah. And the really crucial part of this is that there's no audible sound of onset there. So I'm not hearing like nothing and then sudden, Do you hear that like kind of pop?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a kind of onset where the vocal folds have already decided, okay, bitch, I'm closed. We're ready for the airflow. And then the airflow has to reach a certain threshold, what we call phonation threshold pressure, to then cause the vocal folds to separate and then produce phonation. So that produces a very audible initial separation of the folds, and it sounds like a little bit like a grunt or what we might call otherwise a glottal attack. So something like this. Ah, 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 where we can hear that very sharp little start to the sound. Instead, we want a very gradual start to the onset. Ah, ah, ah. It's like, where does that onset actually begin? Who knows? It's kind of a secret. It's a secret even from me. I just know that as I go to phonate, the sound of the onset just kind of begins with a gradual bloom of sound rather than a sudden, forceful sound production. So that's the sound of a really gradual and balanced onset. Now, on either end of this spectrum, we've got some kinds of onset that are important to think about. We can think that there's a breath first tendency, which is going to be a little bit inefficient, and a closure first tendency. And on top of the closure first tendency, there's a secondary false fold closure first tendency that people will have. So we're going to address each one. The first thing we're going to think of is the closure first tendency. And here you can hear that was that sudden and abrupt you can hear a small little spike on the sound, but it doesn't have any noise to it, right? This is not what I would call maladaptive. It can be undesirable for various reasons, but it doesn't necessarily sound inefficient. It's not the most desirable sound, especially in the case of feminization, because that increased pressure can cause things downstream to get fucked up. So, for example,
If I'm really small and I go, uh, uh,
that sudden pressure release is going to cause the structures of my throat to fluctuate in size because they're not prepared for that sudden pressurization, right? So we don't want to make that our default kind of onset, but for, the sake of like a certain kind of style of music or something, like if I were doing like, oh, darling, right? Oh, that kind
Yeah.
of, sorry for the clipping. I literally put my hand in front of my mic and it still didn't help. So regardless, and I turned away my whole body. It was just a lot. Sorry, it was too loud. But that like sharp punch has some stylistic merit, perhaps, in singing. So I don't want to just poo-poo that sound altogether. But I do want to say, with the caveat, that it's not ideal for speech. Cool. So that's our first kind of strategy for onsets. It's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world. Sometimes, though, people don't just close the true folds when they're preparing for the onset of the sound. They also seal shut the false folds. And when that happens, then we start to hear this kind of less efficient start to the sound. Right. And so here, for example, that blocked sound persists in the sound. And here I released it. Ideally, I don't even want it to start. I don't even want to have that sound to begin with. So for this, the solution is actually, it's like one of those games where there's like a triangle attack. It's like, like water beats fire, fire beats grass, grass beats water. Like it's like that kind of behavior. And for this, I actually like to start intentionally with a breathy onset. So let's talk about that. With a breathy onset, you can hear airflow first. Now, the airflow first idea can still be accompanied by constriction. So the airflow could sound like this. And if that is the case,
Gross.
then you need to work on just getting exhalation that is totally released and relaxed, right? Because if you start with this kind of breath flow is not going to do us any good. Okay. So instead, we want the only kind of constriction. Sometimes when people get this like H in their exhalation, that like persistent H sound that indicates false fold constriction, I like to redirect them to thinking about the airflow at their lips, sometimes by producing an F or by just blowing like you're blowing out a candle. And here it can be helpful to like literally tap your lips. So you're getting that airflow. And as I tap my lips and the opening of my mouth, it causes the sound to stop because I'm literally controlling that airflow here at the lips rather than back here at the glottis. So, I mean, you can try your best. Start with an H. Try to do an H and an F at the same time. It's quite difficult. Please, I invite you, try it out.
With the constriction or without?
Yeah, so with the H, you'll be constricted automatically, and then layer on an F sound at your lips. That wasn't actually you managed to do that, and the airflow sounded pretty relaxed as well, so that was pretty chill. But if you try seal shut your lips a little bit more. Do you hear that when you seal shut your lips further, it shifts the balance and the pressure in the back of your throat starts to cause the structures around the false
Yeah.
fold to expand. It's
Yeah.
also
I
uncomfortable.
can
It's
feel
kind
it
of
start to
shitty.
tighten up.
Point being, if we are
I just think of jet plane noises because it sounds like a jet turbine.
I don't know, I'm not familiar enough with jet turbines. Clearly. Hold on, I'm gonna have a sip of water. Slurp. Delicious. I don't know if you're not seasoning your water, you should get on it. It's very yummy. So
Put some chemicals in it.
put a little chemical in it. Put a little 1 or 2 chemical in your chemical. So that initiation of the sound, if you've got a tendency towards that blocked sound, that constricted kind of phonation, then the thing to do is to start with a really pure exhalation. Right? Just exhale silently. Or exhale so the only noise is the noise from your lips. And then add in phonation. Or F into V. Again, we can hear that there's a creation of sound, but the airflow started first. So we've got a consistent stream of airflow, and then the folds shut over that consistent stream. This is going to help rewrite our tendency in a blocked kind of onset to seal shut first, and then let the pressure build up, build up, build up, build up until the muscles give out and we start to get sound, right? That cannot be the way that we approach phonation. Go ahead and try that again from F to V just so we can hear that.
With the
Yes.
mm,
Very good.
mm,
Now I want you to slowly decrease the length of time between the F and the V. So you'll start waiting a couple seconds, now getting for like 1 second of F, and then finally half a second.
that
Until it starts at exactly the same time and it's a V sound from the beginning. Try that slow change.
one.
One more, just a V. Good. So that slow transition away, right? We started breathy and then we made the onset more gradual. So we start breathy and we add closure. Start breathy, add closure. Decrease the amount of the duration of breathiness, add closure. Decrease the duration of breathiness again, add closure. Then we do that so many times that we're decreasing the duration of the breathiness so that the sort of inception of the breathy quality or the breath flow starts at exactly the same time that the vocal folds close, and that's how we train towards a more balanced sound. We could also, right, approach this the other direction. Like let's say that we have a heavily constricted sound, right? Release and relax into sound production. But honestly, this is harder because sometimes people will release and relax part of the sound, or they will release a little bit of constriction, but still maintain some little thread of constriction that can sometimes hide and only manifests later on when we start playing with size, for example, right? We start doing something
Oh,
else.
yes.
So my go-to sound here is no matter what end of the spectrum you're having difficulties with. If you're a breathier onset kind of person or a blocked onset kind of person, convert into a breathy onset first. Start with breath, then add phonation, and then see if while you're adding phonation, you can make sure that there's no constriction coming along. Then shorten the duration of the breathiness until the breath and the closure begin at exactly the same time. So that's how we resolve onset issues. Finally, sustain issues. And here's where it's important to just kind of be cognizant of the many different ways that if inefficiency can manifest in the voice. We can have breathiness in a sound, and that indicates inefficiency. We can have creak or fry, which are the same thing in a sound, and that will also manifest as a kind of inefficiency. And then finally, we can have constriction, and constriction can happen concurrently with any other thing. You can have otherwise totally healthy phonation and constriction. You can have breathy phonation and constriction. You can have creak and constriction. So constriction can happen as an extra layer on top of all of this stuff because it's not actually describing a behavior of your true folds, it's describing the engagement of the false folds. And the false false
Folds.
folds can engage or disengage over top of any kind of glottal behavior. Okay, so let's
Can we
talk
take a
through.
slight detour and mention that vocal fry isn't bad?
Yes,
I feel like if someone listens to this, they're gonna be like, "Oh
we're
no,
gonna use fry and creek.
inefficient."
Yeah, I want to go through the kinds of inefficient sounds that we can produce, and then spend some time doing a little bit of both. So breathiness first, and then we'll talk about creek and how they kind of functionally form a kind of coherent little continuum of sound. So When we start with a breathy sound, what is happening? The vocal folds are vibrating. Let's say we don't start breathy. What if we start with a totally efficient ah, and then over time, this happens. Ah, ah. So what's happening here? There is some lack of closure in the vocal folds that is producing that audible sound of breathiness. So when the vocal folds are vibrating, they're sealing shut over the glottis and converting all of the airflow that's pressed against the underside of the folds and chopping all of that air up into sound. If there is a partial opening, either because of vocal fold bowing or because of an incomplete kind of closure, which has sort of an open glottal gap in the posterior end of the vocal folds, we hear that as breathiness, right? Ah, ah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Pardon my rice cooker. So we can hear that kind of breathy, one, right? That just means that my vocal folds, for whatever reason, because I relaxed or because I'm actually trying to get a breathy sound, sometimes it's useful for artistic purposes or for expressive purposes to achieve a breathier sound. I think famously we can think of, voices like Marilyn Monroe, where a huge part of the sort of sultriness of her voice is reliant on that kind of breathiness, right? But in general, we hear what we might call a tendency to be aspirate from a lot of different voices trying to achieve a lot of different effects.
So if I'm down here and I'm like actively trying to cultivate a little bit more of like a sultry, breathy
Dommy
kind of
mommy kind
sound.
of vibe.
Yeah, very
Yes.
dommy mommy. So if we're like 1, 2, 3, don't make me count to 10 or whatever, like that kind of sound, you can hear it starts to clean up when I start to get more of this fry. 1, 2, 3.
Functionally, fry and breathiness are kind of flip sides of a coin. When the vocal folds are partially open and are allowing air to escape during phonation, that's going to be audible as breathiness. When the vocal folds are fully sealed and then so sealed that they are resisting the airflow and preventing the air from vibrating the entire length of the vocal fold, that's when we start to hear creak or fry manifest. Both of these sounds, I think, are absolutely fine, except with the caveat that they are slightly inefficient. So you may feel like you need to develop a sense of stamina with them. With breathiness, I definitely feel when I'm modeling breathiness, and I'm always modeling breathiness at like 110%, so that's part of what the issue is. But when I'm modeling breathiness, 1, 1, 2, 3, I can't really get a lot of syllables out before I immediately have to inhale because I'm just not getting the kind of resistance at the glottis that I'm used to getting. 1, 2, 3. So I end up kind of taking little mini breaths between each one. With fry,
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hello. Yeah. So you can hear that like more creaky fry quality starting to manifest in the sound, and it immediately deleted that breathiness. So if I were to do that as a single continuum from breathy to creaky, you're going to hear that it passes through a little sweet spot where it's neither breathy nor creaky, but instead purely efficient. So I'll show you what this sounds like. All right, we can hear the breathiness there. So on my way to
on my way back and forth between those sounds, I'm going to pass through the Goldilocks zone where the breath flow, closure, and the sound all kind of meet at this point and they're balanced and we get a more efficient sound. So if you are someone who struggles with breathiness and you feel like you have a hard time deleting breathiness, I think that starting with a breathy sound and someone trying to aim for more fry is going to be really useful. And if you are someone who wants to learn to sort of get rid of fry because you feel like you fall into it all the time, you may want to energize the breath a little bit more. You may want to put through a higher degree of volumetric airflow, that is the literal volume of air that you're pushing through, to delete that creak and provide enough fuel for the fire to get the vocal folds vibrating fully. So those are the sort of inefficiencies that I think are not super dangerous. And yeah, I mean, we can explore this and just kind of play with one or the other. If you start super breathy, if you feel like you have breathiness as a tendency, you can just go one, one, and really overdo it. Really feel what it feels like to overdo breathiness. One, 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 and then see if you can remove the sound of breathiness. And if you keep removing the sound of breathiness and you pull back on the airflow further, it should eventually go one, 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 and turn into creak. So that's that kind of relationship that we're looking at. If someone feels like they're super creaky, one, 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 increase the airflow, and it will often help provide enough and fuel so that the sound causes the vocal folds to vibrate, the breath causes the vocal folds to vibrate along their entire length rather than just getting that kind of bubbly fry sound. Finally, false fold constriction. So we talked about that blocked onset and then that kind of like both blocked and constricted sound that we sometimes get. And our goal is obviously to avoid any kind of false fold constriction. So I'm going to layer on breathiness and then constriction on top. One, one, two, three. That's just breath. One, two, three. And now, one, two, three. You can hear that there's not just the airflow, not just the turbulence of the airflow, but it starts to get a kind of squeezed quality as well. Ooh, ooh. And we can hear the airflow for sure still, but on top of that airflow, there's like this squeezed kind of quality. And that's the false fold constriction that we want to monitor for. Similarly, we can hear the same thing arise with fry. If I start with fry and go, yeah, let's start down here because it's not going to happen higher right now. Yeah. Okay, so here, now you can hear it's still fry, but it's like fry plus something. Hello.
Like Dracula vibes.
It is a little vampiric, right? So if I go again, let me find a nice pure fry. Oh, yeah, right down here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Even though I called it a pure fry, but it's just, I mean, there's still a periodicity in that sound. The sound doesn't sound like
Yes.
consistent, easy, efficient phonation, but it doesn't have that extra element of squeeze. So I'm going to start again with that more efficient kind of fry, slightly more. Right. And then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's nice and fry. And now I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can hear that on top of the fry, that constriction got kind of layered on. That's going to be the other kind of constriction we can get there. And then if I start with a pure sound, a very efficient sound, and go, ah, and I just start getting a little bit of constriction, you can hear that this manifests. If I take it really extreme, we really hear that sound. Because
Dying.
what ends up happening is that the vocal folds, right, they're vibrating and they're fine with the amount of air that's there. And then the false folds close over top of that and create a very high pressure situation. And now the vocal folds need to have a ton of air pushed through. Questions so far about any of these different kinds of inefficiencies?
Nope. None.
Cool. Then final thoughts. The best way to train towards this efficient kind of phonation would be to utilize SOVTEs, especially something like a straw in water. If you are someone who struggles sort of habitually with constriction, breathiness, or, undesired fry, then something you can do is get a straw, get water, and phonate through that. We've done a lot in this, server talking about SOVTs.
I made a meme of
There's
it.
a meme of it. They really are lifesavers, and they do a lot for. They're doing a lot for the community, is I guess what I'm saying. So, and then if you want, you can then layer that SOVTE stuff on top of the VFE framework, the vocal function exercise framework, to sort of start to develop the sense of consistent, clean, clear, efficient production. So these are the sort of broad types of inefficiency. Here are some other little sounds to look out for that are going to be signs of a lack of clarity in the sound. And these are all little perturbations, little variations in how much airflow versus how much closure versus how much comfort sustaining that closure we have. So, these are hard for me to replicate because they are a fundamentally inefficient sound that I have trained myself out of to a degree that it is really hard to try to emulate. So I'm going to do my best, but we'll see. The first is shimmer. Okay, so shimmer is a change in intensity of the sound. It's going to sound like it varies from loudness, from like a louder sort of sound to a softer sort of sound inconsistently. So I'll try my best to illustrate what this sounds like while not illustrating some of the other kinds of inefficiency that we might expect. So if I were to go, ah, that's totally fine, right? That's a highly efficient kind of phonation. Versus where there's a fluctuation in how much weight is being used or how much loudness is being used, being produced by the folds. So when we start to get, if you've ever had someone who's talking and you can hear little kinds of like fluctuations in the sustained sound where it feels like it's like something really soft and suddenly really loud, those are going to be signs of shimmer in the sound, and that's something that we want to avoid. The other kind of sort of inefficiency or lack of clarity that we might be subject to is jitter. So shimmer and jitter. Jitter is an instability of pitch. So this is something that manifests again for similar reasons. There's some kind of imbalance between the glottal behavior and airflow. So that's what this sounds like. I'll show you. So regular sound. Fine, whatever. This is actually a little noisier than I would desire otherwise, but totally fine. And now, we can hear that is really wobbly. It's wobbly.
I think cis people call that puberty.
But here's the thing: it can happen not just with this weight fluctuation break situation. Sometimes it happens like, I guess I'm kind of conflating both of these. When I'm trying to illustrate them, I'm getting both jitter and shimmer because I can't just get inefficient in one. I'm getting inefficient in both. So I'm getting this like fluctuation in the volume. So that would maybe a better illustration, the first of shimmer and then of jitter. Where there's a little fluctuate. And eventually, honestly, a kind of controlled jitter is vibrato, right? If I start with that still has fluctuation in the pitch, but it's a desirable fluctuation that people like to hear, certain people. So certain styles of music require it or find it aesthetically pleasing.
But it's deliberate. It's not clumsy.
Exactly. And that's ultimately all of this shit is it deliberate or is it clumsy sounding? If you're fluctuating in volume intentionally, that's no longer, I mean, if I were to do that's a kind of weird sound.
That's a Nightcore version of Mandark's laugh.
Yeah, that's it for sure. So yeah, we can hear it. I mean, it sounded weird, but it sounded deliberate. So we're chill. But if it doesn't sound deliberate, then we're wandering into inefficient territory. Anything that we do here, breathiness, fry, even false fold constriction, all of them can be used artfully and with intention, but we consider them inefficient because they show that there's not a totally balanced conversion between airflow and sound. Long term, being able to control that and engage, a certain degree of jitter or shimmer or false fold constriction or breathiness at will is actually a sign of having some really solid foundational control of the voice. So it's something I think everyone should play with and start to discover on their own. But especially if all you're trying to do is speed run feminization or masculinization, then you can just say, false fold constriction, that's the no-no zone. I'm not going to fuck with that, and you can avoid it altogether. And I think that is, you're not going to hurt yourself by avoiding constriction. Okay, so that's it, right? That's all I've got on efficiency at this moment.
Hell yeah.
Cool.
But we never wrapped around to vocal fry or like why it's not bad. Slash.
For the reasons I just outlined, right? They're aesthetic. And when I went deeper into breathiness, I was like, this is fine, right? It's a sultry kind of sound. It doesn't really hurt. What matters is if you're also getting false fold constriction on top. That's the thing that really matters. Inefficient,
Got it.
to be honest, efficiency is bullshit, right? Because there's no such thing as efficient vocal production. As I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, this is a system that is designed to prevent choking, not a system that is designed to produce sound, and it is not optimized for sound production. We're not machines and we're not synthesizers. We are accidental meat instruments. And so the production of the sound is always going to have some inherent degree of inefficiency in it, but we can minimize the sound of inefficiency as much as we can, and we want to, in fact. So yeah, when we get breathiness, it is something that can be artfully done, aesthetically done. When we get, fry, it's something that is artful and illustrates a sort of decrease in energy at the end of a sentence, for example. That's totally normal. It's when we get uncontrolled versions of both of those things that we have to start investigating why.
Got it.
Cool. All right, let me delete this robot.